Open Google Earth. Zoom out until you can see the entire planet. Spin the globe. Look at every continent. You can zoom into any street in Tokyo. You can count the cars in a parking lot in Kansas. You can read the license plates on boats in the Mediterranean. The resolution is extraordinary. Every mountain ridge, every river bend, every farmer's field. The modern world has been mapped to a level of detail that would have been indistinguishable from magic 50 years ago. Now spin the globe to the bottom, look at Antarctica, zoom in, and watch the resolution collapse. The crisp, detailed, high-resolution imagery that covers every other square meter of the Earth's surface dissolves into a featureless white smear. Low resolution, blurred, patched together from different data sources at different times with different quality levels. Large areas are simply blank, white, undifferentiated, as if the most powerful satellite imaging systems ever built, systems that can photograph a golf ball from orbit, suddenly lose their capability when pointed at the southern continent. Now, look at the edges. Look at the coastal regions of Antarctica, where the ice meets the sea. Some areas have reasonable resolution. You can see research stations. You can see ice formations. But move inland, move south of the 78th parallel, and the imagery degrades further. The continent that covers over 14 million square kilometers, larger than Europe, larger than the continental United States, becomes a blur, a white void on a map that shows everything else on Earth in extraordinary detail. This raises a simple but critical question. Why? The official explanation is technical. Antarctica is covered in ice. White ice reflects light uniformly. Satellite imaging systems struggle with featureless white surfaces because there's no contrast for the sensors to resolve. The imagery looks poor because the terrain is poor. There's nothing to see because there's nothing there, just ice, miles and miles of flat, white, featureless ice. And that explanation works for the interior ice sheet. If you're photographing a flat white surface, the image will look like a flat white surface. But the explanation doesn't account for the coastal regions, the mountain ranges that protrude through the ice, the nunataks and exposed rock formations that should provide exactly the kind of contrast that satellite sensors excel at resolving. These features exist, they're documented in geological surveys, and they're blurred on the publicly available satellite imagery with the same low resolution applied to the featureless interior. The deeper I went, the more I found that the imaging problem isn't technical, it's political. Because Antarctica isn't mapped poorly because the technology can't handle it. Antarctica is mapped poorly because the imagery is restricted, deliberately, by the agencies that control the satellites and the governments that control the agencies. Pull up the imaging history yourself. Military and intelligence satellites have been photographing every inch of the Earth's surface since the 1960s. The resolution of classified military satellite imagery exceeds anything available to the public by orders of magnitude. The National Reconnaissance Office, the agency that operates America's spy satellites, has been collecting imagery of Antarctica since the Cold War. The imagery exists, it's been collected, it's stored in classified databases, and it's not released, not at the resolution available for the rest of the planet, not at the resolution that would allow independent researchers to examine the Antarctic surface with the same detail available for any suburb in Ohio. The silence was deafening. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now look at the legal framework. Because Antarctica isn't just poorly mapped, it's the most legally restricted continent on Earth. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959 by 12 nations and now adhered to by over 50, established Antarctica as a scientific preserve. No military activity, no mineral extraction, no territorial claims enforced. The continent is governed by international agreement as a zone of peace and science. On paper, this sounds noble, a continent preserved for all humanity, a rare moment of international cooperation in the middle of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, at the height of nuclear brinkmanship, agreed to set aside an entire continent for peaceful scientific research. The treaty is presented in every history textbook as one of the great diplomatic achievements of the 20th century, and it is. But the deeper I went into the treaty's provisions, the more I found that the treaty doesn't just protect Antarctica for science. It controls Antarctica through science. Because the treaty doesn't give everyone access, it gives signatory nations access, specifically nations that maintain active research programs on the continent. You can't just go to Antarctica. You need permission. You need affiliation with a national Antarctic program. You need to submit your research plans for review. You need to follow protocols established by the treaty parties. Independent research is effectively impossible. Independent exploration is effectively prohibited. The continent that belongs to all humanity can only be accessed by people who belong to the right institutions. This raises a question that the noble narrative never addresses. What is the treaty actually protecting? The environment? Certainly. The fragile Antarctic ecosystem deserves protection. Scientific integrity? Presumably. But the treaty also protects something else. Access. Control over who goes, where they go, what they look for, and what they're allowed to report finding. The deeper I went into the history of Antarctic exploration, the more I found that the period immediately before the treaty was signed was a period of intense, competitive, militarized exploration of the continent, and the things that were found during that period have never been fully disclosed. Go look at Operation High Jump. In 1946 and 1947, the United States Navy conducted the largest Antarctic expedition in history. Over 4,000 personnel, 13 ships, multiple aircraft. The operation was led by Admiral Richard Byrd, the most famous polar explorer in American history. The official purpose was to establish the Antarctic research base Little America 4, to train personnel for cold weather operations, and to photograph and map as much of the Antarctic coastline as possible. The operation was planned for 6 to 8 months. It was terminated after approximately 8 weeks, ahead of schedule. The official explanation was weather, ice conditions, the ordinary hazards of Antarctic operations. But the timing of the withdrawal has been questioned by researchers for decades, because the operation had been launched with enormous resources and ambitious goals that were nowhere near completion when it was called off. And here's the detail that has generated the most discussion and the least official clarification. In a press conference following the expedition, Admiral Byrd made statements that have been quoted, debated, and analyzed ever since. He spoke about the strategic importance of Antarctica. He described the continent in terms that went beyond scientific interest into something that sounded closer to military concern. He referenced the possibility of hostile forces operating from polar regions. His language was measured but unmistakable. He was describing Antarctica not as a frozen wasteland, but as a territory of strategic significance whose importance the public didn't yet understand. The Antarctic Treaty was signed 12 years later. The continent was locked down. Access was restricted to approved scientific programs. Independent exploration was effectively eliminated, and the high-resolution satellite imagery that would allow anyone to examine the Antarctic surface in detail from the comfort of their computer was degraded to a resolution that shows nothing. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision when you look at what else the treaty prohibits. Because the treaty doesn't just prohibit military activity, it prohibits mineral extraction, it prohibits territorial sovereignty claims, and it prohibits, through the Protocol on Environmental Protection adopted in 1991, any activity relating to mineral resources other than scientific research. Antarctica's mineral resources, which geological surveys suggest are substantial, including coal, iron ore, and potentially petroleum and natural gas, cannot be exploited under the current treaty framework. The minerals are there, the prohibition is there, and the prohibition is maintained by the same nations whose energy companies would benefit most from lifting it. The official explanation is environmental protection. And environmental protection is genuinely important. The Antarctic ecosystem is fragile. Mineral extraction would cause irreparable damage. The prohibition makes environmental sense. But the prohibition also ensures that no independent entity, no nation outside the treaty framework, no private company, no unaffiliated researcher can access the continent's resources or conduct independent surveys of what those resources actually are. Here's where I need you to look at something specific, the subglacial geography of Antarctica. Because what's beneath the ice is not what most people imagine. Antarctica isn't a flat plain of ice over flat rock. Beneath the ice sheet, the continent has mountains higher than the Alps, valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, lakes over 400 subglacial lakes, bodies of liquid water that have been sealed beneath the ice for millions of years, isolated from the atmosphere, potentially hosting ecosystems that have evolved independently for longer than the human species has existed. Lake Vostok, the largest subglacial lake in Antarctica, approximately the size of Lake Ontario, buried under nearly 4 kilometers of ice, sealed from the surface for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. In 2012, Russian researchers drilled through the ice and reached the lake surface. The samples they retrieved showed evidence of microbial life, life that had been isolated beneath the Antarctic ice sheet for millions of years. The deeper I went into the subglacial research, the more I found that what's beneath the Antarctic ice is not well understood. Not because the technology to investigate it doesn't exist, because the investigation is controlled. Every drilling project requires approval. Every sample is processed through institutional channels. Every finding is published through official programs. The science is real. The researchers are genuine. But the framework within which they operate is managed with a thoroughness that ensures no result reaches the public without institutional review. And the imagery that would allow anyone with an internet connection to examine the Antarctic surface in detail. That imagery remains degraded, blurred, restricted. While every other surface on Earth is available in resolution that can identify individual trees, I'm not telling you there are alien bases under the Antarctic ice. I'm not telling you there's a hidden civilization beneath the South Pole. I'm telling you that the largest unmapped territory on Earth is deliberately kept unmapped, that the satellite imagery is deliberately degraded, that the legal framework governing the continent is designed to control access, not just protect the environment, that the most powerful military expedition ever sent to Antarctica was terminated ahead of schedule under circumstances that have never been fully explained, that subglacial features of extraordinary significance, mountains, valleys, lakes sealed for millions of years, exist beneath the ice and are investigated exclusively by institutional programs with institutional oversight. I'm telling you that below the 78th parallel, the rules change. The transparency that governs every other square meter of the Earth's surface disappears. The openness that allows you to zoom into any street in any city on any continent dissolves into a white blur. The freedom of movement that allows you to buy a plane ticket to virtually any destination on Earth stops at a continent that an international treaty says belongs to everyone and an international framework ensures is accessible to almost no one. I'm asking, what's beneath the ice that requires this level of control? What's on the surface that requires this level of image degradation? What Admiral Byrd saw that required this level of institutional response? What the treaty is protecting that justifies restricting an entire continent to approved researchers from approved nations pursuing approved questions? I'm asking why the most restricted place on Earth is the one place the public is told has nothing worth restricting. Go open Google Earth, zoom to the bottom of the world, watch the resolution collapse, watch the detail disappear, watch the most advanced imaging technology in human history suddenly become unable to show you what's there. Ask yourself what you're not being shown.